electronically at least. Hope everyone's doing kind of well out there amongst the current situation. And for those of you in Queensland still, I'm kind of jealous of the warmth as we are starting winter here in Victoria, and I'm kind of sitting here kind of cold and usually in my beanie, but not right now. But yes, Brock did mention I had quite a diverse background, which you'll see from the talk, but I'll go ahead and jump right into it, kind of give you a bit of background on where I'm based. So I'm based at Deakin University, which is in kind of the southern end of Victoria. We've got kind of three main campuses and one kind of satellite campus, one in Melbourne, one in Geelong, and one in Western Victoria out in Warrnambool. And I'm actually based down kind of at the mouth of Port Phillip Bay, where the mouth kind of pointer is right now at the Queenscliff Marine Station, jointly with the Victorian Fisheries Department down there, which is kind of a new partnership that Deakin has just had. I can assure you it doesn't look this nice all the time. It's usually quite cold, but that's the facilities. We have a large aquaculture facility, really revamping the marine facility as well, and doing kind of a lot of temperate marine research. Just a couple of nicer photos. Usually doesn't look like that, but that's the mouth of Port Phillip Bay and the red circle where the Queenscliff Marine Station is. Usually, for what most people probably know this area of the world from, is things kind of like the Great Ocean Road, Viking tourist, things like the 12 Apostles, or for my personal preference, surfing is quite a popular thing down here. But we do have quite a diverse range of marine species as well, having been part of the Great Southern Reef, a lot of kelp forest, and I'm a bit biased to some of these species because these are the ones I work on. But there is quite a diverse range of temperate marine fish and crustaceans down here as well. As Brock alluded to, I did do my PhD in postgraduate studies up at JCU, where I mostly worked on kind of trophic ecology and management of reef sharks and large fishes. After that, I did have a bit of a brief stint in tourism before going on to Tasmania to work on the commercial southern rock lobster and giant crab fisheries. And then moving on to now, so most of my projects now are just kind of getting up and running at my new role at Deakin that I've started about a year and a half ago. So as such, nothing has really come in from the results side of things, but just to give you a bit of a background on what I do. Currently still involved in the rock lobster giant crab space, helping the state government out with their stock assessments. We've also got a joint project with the New South Wales government, where we're looking at eDNA to detect nearshore presence of white sharks. But the caveat out there, I'm not on this project as the geneticist. I'm kind of helping out link the DNA data to the tagging data to make sure that the sharks we're observing in the water from the genetic signatures are actually those that we're detecting from the tags as well. Also do a bit of work on chimera species. So this is elephant fish, which is a popular recreational fishery down here. Work in collaboration with some folks in South America and New Zealand as well. Also work on kind of fisheries bycatch, age and growth, and some ecological studies from skate bycatch caught in the Patagonian toothfish fishery down near in the Southern Ocean, and that's in collaboration with some of the guys at the Australian Antarctic Division based in Kingston, Tasmania. Also do a bit of work on the recreational bluefin tuna fishery, kind of some citizen sciences type work, and very recently trying to get a project up and running with Brock and Aaron McNeil, looking at compliance in the bluefin tuna fishery. That's really quite early days on that project as well. And then more recently, had a recently funded FRDC project to do a lot of movement and tracking work on the commercial rock flathead species, which is the one on the bottom there, as well as the recreational kingfish fishery as well. So looking at movement. So as you can see, quite a diverse topic. So hence why you might have noticed from my abstract, I'm not going to be discussing one cohesive topic throughout this talk. More or less, it's going to be three kind of bits and pieces of recent projects that have finished. So one, going to talk about coral reef shark conservation on the Great Barrier Reef, which was kind of the last of my at least kind of lead tropical work. Discuss some of the marine wildlife tourism work I've done in South Australia with colleagues down there. And then some bait supply work that we've done in collaboration with the commercial fishing industry, again, mostly in Tasmania, but across all kind of the southern states as well. So I'll go ahead and get into it for the first one, looking at the effect of human exclusion zones and how I argue that they outperform no-take marine reserves on the Great Barrier Reef. And this work was done in collaboration with Ashley Frisch, who is now at Reef HQ, but he was also at the ARC as well. So for many people in this room, I probably don't have to kind of harp on about what a no-take marine reserve is, but for the purposes of this talk and my definition, what I've used is that I refer to no-take marine reserves where all extractive use is prohibited. Oftentimes because of this, they're often promoted to rebuild overexploited fish and shark populations. And if they are well managed and have high compliance rates, they can sometimes achieve this. And alluding to that kind of well enforced, well managed, if they are actually well enforced, these no-take reserves can help build sometimes quite rapidly target fish populations from a fishery perspective. However, there's also other cascading benefits that no-take marine reserves can have. One of them is improved fishery yields in outlying areas, as well as increased biodiversity within their boundaries as well. However, oftentimes no-take marine reserves are used as a baseline in many studies of community structure and fishing effects. And what I mean by baseline is oftentimes they're referred to as an unexploited area with this intact ecology and kind of untouched from the human footprint. And hopefully by the end of this portion of the talk, I'll convince you that may not be the case. And oftentimes because of this, it's actually shaped our perceptions of what an undisturbed or sometimes thrown out pristine ecosystem should look like. For those of you that aren't aware of the protection history on the GBR, which are probably a few that are listening to this talk, but generally speaking, historically, all parts of the GBR were actually open to fishing. And then between about 1980 and 2004, there was a series of no-take reserves that were implemented, which resulted in a large-scale network of no-take reserves that range in age from 14 to 39 years, could be about 40 years now. During that time, though, that the no-take marine reserves were implemented, they also implemented strictly enforced human exclusion areas, or otherwise referred to as no-entry zones. And this was generally implemented to guard against the impacts of things like non-extractive uses of things like scuba, as well as other things. Some of the pink zones have little small sand cays that are important for bird migration and sea turtle hatching as well. So our approach in a nutshell, due to that exclusion from humans from those no-entry zones, largely speaking from a shark population size perspective, they're quite largely unknown. And what this does is it really prevents an evaluation of whether shark recovery in those zones is actually ongoing, or whether it's complete, or whether it's actually meeting the conservation objectives. And as I alluded to, those diverse ages of those reserves and zones, in the absence of not being able to have continually monitored those populations throughout time, it allows for us to do a spatially controlled opportunity to investigate shark population recovery. So what we did, we surveyed 34 reefs on underwater time swims that lasted 45 minutes, where we towed a GPS to calibrate the survey area. And we surveyed a pretty large spatial gradient, latitudinal gradient of the Great Barrier Reef that encompassed 10 fish zones in blue color, 11 no-take zones in the green color, and 13 no-entry zones in the pink color. And those colors will be used throughout the portion of the talk with regards to certain figures. The main species of interest were reef sharks, so black-tip reef sharks, gray reef sharks, and white-tip reef sharks, but we did also count everything else we saw. That included some kind of tawny nurse sharks, a few tiger sharks, and a few silver-tip sharks as well. So jumping into some of the findings, one of the first biggest findings was that overall we found that there was a 50% greater both density and biomass of sharks in no-entry reserves compared to no-take zones as well as to fish zones. And graphically, what does this look like? So on the top, we've got density in hectares, and on the bottom out, we got biomass in hectares. And in both cases, we have significantly more density as well as biomass of sharks in those pink zones, those are entry zones, compared to the no-take zones and fish zones. And there was actually no difference in the no-take zones compared to the fish zones, which was quite surprising. And for those of you kind of out there wondering, did you look at anything else, any other effects? We did. So we also looked at things like coral cover, topographic complexity, reef size, distance to shore, distance to nearest fished reef, as well as reserve age. And overwhelmingly, that effective zone no entry came out having the most positive effect on both shark density on the left and shark biomass on the right. Secondly, and more importantly probably, is we found that it probably takes upwards of 20 to 40 years of really quite strong protection to rebuild quote unquote near natural shark populations on the Great Barrier Reef. So what does this look like? On the top, again, we have density, and on the bottom we have biomass. We have reserve age on the x-axis, and each of the colored dots represents the different management zones. And we did population growth curves where the fixed solid line is model average coefficients from a logistic, a Gompertz, and an asymptotic growth model. And then dotted lines are the 95% bootstrap confidence intervals. And really the main takeaway behind this is where both of those lines start to asymptote or flatten out, which would indicate population recovery. And neither of the graphs really start to flatten out until that kind of 20-year mark and extend out into that 40-year mark, indicating that it may take, multiple decades for shark populations to recover, at least on the Great Barrier Reef. What we also did was we data mined some of the areas from shark biomass from the literature that quite commonly referred to as pristine areas in the Pacific Ocean. So the location on the bottom are no take zones and are no entry zones, and all of these are compared to our fish zones. We also looked at the Mariana, the Pitcairn, Hawaii, and the Line Islands. And to interpret this graph, the value closest to 1 indicates very little difference between, say, a fish zone and a no take zone, whereas the ratio of fish to unfished biomass, the lower the number, the higher the biomass of sharks. And as you can see, find my little pointer, our pink zone in the no entry was really quite similar to a lot of the other commonly referred to as pristine reef areas throughout the Indo-Pacific. So what does all this mean in terms of take home? I think first one is it's going to take quite a long time of strong protection to rebuild these natural shark populations on the Great Barrier Reef. I think it's pretty clear, and I think the evidence is starting to weigh in, that these human exclusion zones are really quite outperforming traditional no-take reserves at rebuilding shark populations. And I think lastly, in alluding to that kind of rethinking of what constitutes a natural system, I think we need to rethink what actually is a natural system, at least on some coral reefs, as these no-take reserves are often used as ecological baselines, and we may be using those in an incorrect manner. Then to kind of massively shift gears into a completely different topic, going on to some other work with the same theme of sharks, but in a massively different environment, looking at the effects of marine wildlife tourism on a non-target species. This work was done with collaborators at the University of Tasmania, Rodney Fox Shark Expeditions, who runs the boat down in South Australia, and Charlie Huveniers, based in Flinders University in Adelaide in South Australia as well. So in terms of wildlife tourism, it is actually one of the fastest growing sectors of the tourism. And in particular, marine tourism has seen really quite considerable growth and demand with things like, kind of shark cage diving, bull shark feeding out in Fiji, whale shark diving, things like that. And oftentimes these things are quite contentious, and it's mainly due to some of the behavioral effects that's associated with, say, feeding individuals and how that may affect their natural behavior, as well as when you get kind of people like this doing the wrong things and grabbing on the animals and things like that. So it has become quite a contentious issue about whether it's actually kind of a thing that we should be doing. Just to give a bit of background on the white shark cage diving industry, it was initiated firstly in South Australia in the late 1970s. And there are 5 main countries that are undertaking white shark cage diving, or at least pursuing. I think the one in New Zealand isn't quite up and running, or they stopped, but So kind of North America and the US and Mexico and the Faroe Islands and Guadeloupe, South Africa, South Australia, as well as New Zealand. In terms of the white shark cage diving industry in South Australia, happens from a boat, everyone in the cage, and it's done at the mouth of the Spencer Gulf in the North Neptune Islands, which is kind of about an hour and a half flight to Port Lincoln from Adelaide, you can see on a little map from there. In the North Neptunes, a lot of it's done in this kind of protected bay, highlighted by the red circle. And the main form of tactic that we use to look at this behavior of individuals in the white shark cage diving industry was through acoustic tracking and monitoring their movement. And what we use was referred to as a VRAP system, or a VIMCO radio acoustic positioning system. And the idea behind that was to look at the really quite fine scale spatial movements within the bay. The three yellow dots are highlighted by the acoustic array that's deployed underwater. The red one is a shore station. The idea is you have a shark come in, put the little tag in them. Having the three arrays underwater lets you triangulate their position to really quite fine scale degree. That relays it back to the onshore shore station, and you can pretty much monitor any tagged individual within real time. The downside of this is that once they leave the bay, you don't really have any indication of their movement. But really the idea was to look at their fine scale movement when shark cage diving operators were there. So the idea being in the bay, looking at the interaction between the animals and when the actual shark cage diving boat is present, looking at it when the boat is absent as well, and comparing some of that data to some of their natural behavior. So rather than looking at the effect of the white shark, which Charlie has done extensively, we wanted to look at another species to see if some of the effects extend on to species that are not the focus of the tourism industry. So we decided to look at the short-tailed stingray, which is one of the biggest ray species actually in the world, that can get up to about 4 meters in disc width, which is kind of that widest point from their each side of their flaps. And they're occurred throughout southern Australia from about that kind of mid-latitude mark of the entire country, from Western Australia up to about the Queensland border between New South Wales. For being such a small, a large individual, they have quite relatively small home ranges, generally speaking, moving less than 25 kilometers in radius. They feed primarily on teleost and invertebrates, which was a key thing to look at with regards to competition with white sharks, as well as potentially feeding on some of the bait that is used to attract the sharks to the cage diving operation. Initially, we tagged 10 individuals, so a bit of a small sample size at first. They were all female, and they range from about 1 to 1.5 meters. For those of you wondering how we kind of tag these things, they are done all in the cage with kind of modified spear guns, so you don't have to get out. In terms of what we found, so the top graph represents time spent within the acoustic array in minutes per day. The bottom graph represents rate of movement, and the x-axis is each individual array. The gray color is when the cage diving vessel is present, white color when the cage diving vessel is absent, and then comparing it to some of the nighttime behavior. And the first thing to take away from this is there is quite a large variability, so not too many really consistent patterns going on here. However, looking up at the top, some of the key takeaways is when the cage diving vessel is present, generally speaking, for the most part, it seems like the rays are spending more time within the acoustic array. On the bottom, with the rate of movement, a bit more variability going on, and not much of a really consistent pattern going on there. So couldn't really take too much away from that. When we look at what's referred to the kernel utilization distribution, so how much they're actually spending within that array, black being 50%, and time spent within that array, and white being 95% spent within that array. The top figure is when the cage diving vessel was absent, and the bottom being when the cage diving vessel is present. And the takeaway from that is that if you look on the bottom figure, you get that kind of really concentration around where the cage diving vessel is present compared to when it's absent. So what are the implications of this? it is clear that there are some changes in activity, and it might have implications for their overall energy budget. And I kind of posit that the variability in the data might be explained by the trade-off to really quite quickly find and feed on those pieces of bait versus avoiding injuries from those white sharks or other rays. This photo was taken by skipper of the vessel, who's done probably thousands of dives down in the area thus far. And he's seen quite a few times where white sharks have tried to prey on some of the rays, and some of the rays have tried to kind of compete with one another as well. So that's what I kind of think is going on, which results in some of that variability. So it still leaves us with that question: do they extend beyond the focal species of interest? I do think that yes, they do, which does have kind of management implications for how we manage the tourism industry, not just focusing on, say, white sharks in this case. So it does open up a lot more questions than it does answers. However, there was actually a paper published just quite recently from the same group where they were looking at the effect of wildlife tourism provisioning with regards to their diet. They looked at a number of different functional groups, things like kingfish, trevally, wrasse, leatherjacket, zebrafish, as well as rays. And they actually found that all different functional groups responded differently to the chum. So again, it's kind of having that really quite variable response, but they did find that the effects did happen to other species as well. And switching tacks a little bit more again, looking at the supply risk of bait in Australia's southern rock lobster fishery. This is one of the big projects I worked on, or not one of the big, but one of the projects that I led kind of when I was down at the University of Tasmania working on the rock lobster fishery. And this was done in collaboration with Caleb Gardner, who is the head of the kind of the fisheries center down at University of Tasmania. So a bit of a background on the southern rock lobster fishery. It's actually one of Australia's most valuable commercial fisheries, and in the states of Tasmania, Victoria, and South Australia are actually the leading commercially most valuable species to the economy. Although not at this exact moment in time due to obvious reasons, traditionally they have almost exclusively been exported overseas and mainly to China, where they've been marketed as a luxury food item. And just to touch a bit on some sustainability commitments, as this kind of ties into some of the stuff that I'm talking about with regards to the consumer market, where we have kind of many fisheries around the globe pursuing third-party certification. You know, one of these main things that you might have heard of would be Marine Stewardship Council is probably the most important one. And when you combine this with reliable traceability, meaning, when you get a piece of seafood on your plate, you can reliably trace it back, where exactly it came from, what fishery it came from, and if that fishery was sustainable or not, is becoming increasingly important for consumers, knowing that we're kind of have a confidence in the food we're choosing to eat from a sustainable source. In terms of kind of that major player, the Marine Stewardship Council, Western rock lobster in Western Australia actually became the first fishery to be MSC certified. And as such, it's prompted other fisheries to kind of pursue certification as well. And you can really start to get into a lot of things. And as you get into some of the research, you can start really picking holes in this sustainability certification, which I won't get into too much in detail at the moment. But it does involve the consideration of a fishery's performance against a large range of criteria that often extend beyond the species that's actually being targeted. So for instance, in this case, one of them is bait. So for instance, if you're using bait that is from a unsustainable source in large quantities, that's the kind of caveat that I think how most fisheries get tick off on this box. You shouldn't actually be certified as MSC if you're sourcing your bait from an unsustainable fishery. So now off the topic, it might seem kind of boring why to study bait, but I think when you start looking at it in more detail, it does become quite interesting. So in terms of southern rock lobster, they are captured using baited pots, and they can constitute, this bait can constitute quite an important cost to fishing operations. So for instance, in South Australia, bait combined with ice amounted to about 6.5% of the total cost per pot lift. And to put it in perspective, a lot of these fisheries are operating on the scale of when you combine it all together, millions and millions of dollars. So 6.5% ends up being not a small number when it comes to costs. In Tasmania, for example, bait alone comprised 4% of the total cost of a boat per year. And again, on paper, 4% might seem like a small number, but when you factor in, the millions and millions of dollars that they're generating as a fishery, 4% starts to become quite a large number. So the major objectives, I'll put this caveat out here because it was strongly driven by the commercial fishing industry, where many fishers express concern regarding the risk of bait supply, not being able to get the bait that they want, when they want, and the amounts that they want. So the idea behind this particular study was, one, to actually document the current species being used as bait, then assess each species' sustainability status, what their current quota was, so how much each fishery is able to catch from those bait species, as well as how much is actually being landed or actually being caught compared to that quota. And then lastly was to actually investigate fisher perceptions in a more structured way on the risk, on their perceived risk of bait supply. So what did we do? First off, surveys were conducted at state-specific commercial fishery meetings. So in Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and Tasmania. We also elicited the expert opinion through informal, unstructured interviews of kind of major bait suppliers, major seafood processors, and things of that nature, people of that nature. And then we also did a review of the jurisdiction-specific stock assessments of where those bait species are actually coming from. In total, we got 66 total fishers surveyed. Overall, there was about 12 taxa used as bait that amounted to approximately 36,000 tons per year. And generally speaking, most fishers expressed some level of concern over bait supply. Getting into it, just mainly on too much of this table, it's basically those that are highlighted in black right now were the main species of bait that comprise what most fishers used, as well as what most fishers wanted. So things like mackerel, Australian salmon, barracuda, and then in New Zealand they refer to it as kawahi, but that's another species of salmon as well. If you take a look really on the far right where it refers to as stock status, a large of these are either large of them are actually unknown or sustainable, and how some of them can actually be both is in particular in New Zealand. Some of these species have different fisheries jurisdictions, where say one on the North Island might be sustainable and one on the South Island might be unknown. So the idea behind this is that we're kind of sourcing these bait from potential areas of places that have an unknown stock status. The bottom are just kind of the other species that people specified they used as bait. I didn't put it on the table, but there were actually some fishers who stressed that they used things like bluefin tuna frames, which is actually illegal for commercial fishers to use. One fisher said he used mutton bird, which is also actually illegal to use as well. He actually acknowledged that it was legal to do so, but knew that I couldn't tell the law enforcement or anything like that. Some of the social scientists listening may knock me for only having three questions to choose from with regards to fishers' perceptions on their level of concern. Rating whether they were either not at all concerned, whether they were somewhat concerned, or whether they were very concerned. And I have it split by all data, Tasmania and Victoria. I did not have enough samples from Western Australia or South Australia to include in their own data. But the general consensus was that an overwhelming proportion of fishers were somewhat concerned about their future risk of bait supply and if they could get what they wanted. And then just highlighting a few of the quotes from some of the major fisheries processors. So one of the managers at United Fisheries Ltd in New Zealand, which provides Australian industry with a lot of their southern rough lobster industry with a lot of their bait, actually stated that we can't keep up with the demand from the Australian bait market. Another major seafood processor located on King Island, Tasmania, where actually she stated where they were very concerned about the future risk of bait supply future risk of bait supply to the industry. And one of the common themes of discussions that kept coming up with individuals, bait suppliers or the processing individuals, processing plants, was this increased prevalence of competition from other markets. And mainly it's the human consumption market that has really driven the prices of bait up. And that's really come from more developing countries, and in particular Southeast Asia. So a lot of these fish that would be typically used for bait are fetching a higher cost for human consumption in other parts of the world. Greg Long, who is CEO of Frank Mason and Associates, another big seafood processor in Australia, said that the price of bait may increase further as that human consumption demand rises, and again, particularly from those developing countries. But the interesting thing when we start looking at it, and on this table, focusing really on Australia and the small pelagic fishery, whereas if you look over on the right where we have the total allowable commercial catch, which is their quota, so the amount of fish that the small pelagic fishery is actually allowed to catch versus what they actually land. And as you can see, there's quite a large discrepancy between the amount of those type of fish species that could be used as bait versus how much they could land. And it just leaves us to question, is it really a problem of supply in the bait market, or is there some other factor going on? And one of the people who are responsible for kind of going out and owning some of the quota for that bait basically said it comes down to the high cost of catching some of those species like Australian salmon. So it's really quite costly that this gentleman, Stuart Ritchie, said, who is also chairman of the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. It's just basically the high cost of going out and catching that salmon is not really conducive for what the prices are being gathered in the dock for the bait. He anticipates that effort won't increase unless higher demand for bait leads to actual higher prices. And just tying it back into that uncaught quota, one single year of that uncaught quota from the small pelagic fishery in Australia would yield approximately 40 tons of bait. If you do the back of the envelope calculations, that could actually provide the southern rock lobster industry as a whole with over 11 years of bait supply. So again, I think it just highlights that it's a bit more nuanced than just a simple supply and demand. And again, I don't claim to be an economist, but I think it comes back to that whole, supply, the relationship between supply and demand and how that influences price. And with regards to the bait market, I really think that this kind of cartoon summed it up quite nicely. You see that the cola changes in price, but if you look at the amount of cola that's in his hand, the supply hasn't actually changed at all. And I think the problem with bait in the southern rock lobster market is that the supply hasn't actually changed. It's just the price point has actually changed, and it makes commercial fishers think that it's actually harder to get when it's, what they're selling their rock lobster quota for has increased, in the past 20 to 30 years, 3 to 4-fold, but bait price has not increased in that amount either. So I think it just highlights the nuance effect of it not being more of a supply driven problem within the bait market. So some of the conclusions from this, to help out with some of this kind of perceived risks that commercial fishers are having, I think it could be potential to look at alternative bait sources. So one big one is to develop markets to utilize fish waste for bait. So things like other fisheries. Down here in Southern Australia, there's the invasive European carp in a lot of the freshwater systems that particularly commercial fishers in Victoria have stressed that using that European carp is good for bait. The aquaculture industry as well, a lot of those kind of fish frames, things like that. So developing markets where we could utilize some of that fish waste that ends up in the bin usually can use for bait. Also pursuing potential studies of artificial or synthetic baits. There has been a couple of studies that have looked at this in relation to the rock lobster fishery that have kind of found differentiating results, but I don't think they found anything that great that it's going to get much uptake by the commercial fishing industry. So I think it's really developing those other markets. And then moving forward, if this does end up becoming a problem and fisheries are still seeking to pursue some sort of third-party certification scheme for sustainability, I think there really needs to be a more formal reporting scheme with regards to bait to really understand the trends in bait use. So in the Western Australian rock lobster fishery, they've actually monitor random subset of pots for reporting of the amount of bait and type used, so that they can have more of a argument for the amount of bait not influencing the sustainability of the species that they're using as bait. So I think in regards to the southern rock lobster fishery, that should be probably one of the things that are considered mandatory with regards to filling out logbooks and things like that. And with that, I'll end it there and have a whole heap of institutions to thank for either providing funding for the work or funding my salary for doing the work at those institutions. So thank you to everyone on this screen. Thank you for your attention, and be happy to entertain any questions if anyone has any.